The economic weapon just fired. On October 17, 2023, the United States government published a document that declared economic war on China. The document was 73 pages of dense technical regulations. It was written in the bureaucratic language of export controls and licensing requirements. But strip away the jargon, and the truth becomes clear. The United States just banned China from accessing the technology that powers the modern world. The ban targets semiconductors, the tiny chips that run everything from your phone to fighter jets. And the number that matters is $300 billion. That is the value of the Chinese semiconductor industry that the United States just tried to destroy with a single policy document. If you think this is just another trade dispute, another round of tariffs that will be negotiated away, you are dangerously wrong. What just happened is the opening move in a technological Cold War that will reshape the global economy. And the terrifying part is that there is no turning back. The United States has committed to a strategy of complete technological decoupling from China. The Chinese government has vowed to retaliate, and the rest of the world is being forced to choose sides. This is not about national security. The official justification from Washington is national security. The US government claims that advanced semiconductors could be used by the Chinese military. They say they're protecting American technology from being weaponized against American interests. They frame this as a defensive measure, a reasonable precaution. It's a lie. This isn't about security, it's about dominance. It's about the United States looking at China's rapid technological advancement and deciding that the only way to maintain American superiority is to cripple the competition. Here's what the new regulations actually do. They ban the export of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. They ban American companies from providing technical support to Chinese chip makers. They ban American citizens from working for Chinese semiconductor firms. And most devastatingly, they force allied countries, Japan, South Korea, the Netherlands, to comply with these restrictions or face punishment themselves. The United States isn't just cutting off China's access to American technology, it's building a global alliance to strangle China's entire semiconductor industry. The target is specific. The regulations focus on chips made with technology nodes below 14 nanometers. These are the most advanced chips in the world. They power artificial intelligence systems. They run data centers. They enable cutting-edge weapon systems. And China cannot make them without foreign equipment. Chinese semiconductor companies like SMIC, the country's largest chip maker, have been trying for years to develop the capability to produce advanced chips domestically. They've invested billions of dollars. They've recruited top engineers. They've made progress. But they still depend on machines made by companies in the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands. The most critical machines are called extreme ultraviolet lithography systems. They're made by a single Dutch company, ASML. Each machine costs over $150 million. And they are the only way to manufacture the most advanced chips in the world. Without access to these machines, China is locked out of the cutting edge of semiconductor technology. The American regulations don't explicitly ban ASML from selling to China. They don't have to. The United States controls enough of the supply chain, the software, the components, the technical support, that it can effectively veto any sale. And it has. ASML is not allowed to ship its most advanced machines to China. Japan's Tokyo Electron is banned from providing critical equipment. American companies like Applied Materials and Lam Research have been cut off from the Chinese market. China has been technologically blockaded. What this means for your life. But this isn't just a problem for Chinese companies. This is going to affect you directly, because China manufactures a huge portion of the world's electronics. Your phone, your computer, your car, they all contain chips that are either made in China or assembled in China using Chinese components. When the United States cuts off China's access to advanced semiconductors, it doesn't just hurt Chinese companies. It disrupts global supply chains. It increases costs. It creates shortages, and you will pay the price. The automotive industry is already feeling the impact. Modern cars contain hundreds of chips. Many of those chips are made in China or use Chinese components. As Chinese chip makers struggle to source equipment and technology, production will slow. Car prices will rise. Wait times will extend. This is already happening. The electronics industry will be hit even harder. Chinese companies like Huawei, which used to compete with Apple and Samsung, have been devastated by previous rounds of US sanctions. They can no longer access the most advanced chips. Their phones are years behind the competition. Their 5G equipment, which was once the best in the world, has been crippled. But here's where it gets worse. The Chinese government is not going to accept this quietly. They are already preparing retaliation. And they have leverage that most people don't understand. China controls the supply of rare earth elements, the materials needed to manufacture semiconductors and batteries and advanced weapons. China processes over 90% of the world's rare earths. If they decide to restrict exports in response to the US chip ban, the entire global technology sector will grind to a halt. This is mutually assured economic destruction. The United States is betting that it can hurt China more than China can hurt back. But that bet assumes China will play by American rules, and there is no reason to believe they will. The mechanism of technological strangulation. To understand how the United States is trying to destroy $300 billion of Chinese industry, you need to understand how semiconductor manufacturing works. Because the complexity of the supply chain is what makes this ban so devastating. Making an advanced semiconductor requires hundreds of steps and dozens of different types of specialized equipment. You need lithography machines to etch patterns onto silicon wafers. You need deposition equipment to layer materials atom by atom. You need etching systems to remove precise amounts of material. You need inspection tools to verify that each chip meets specifications. And you need clean rooms that are 10,000 times cleaner than a hospital operating room. No single country can do all of this. The semiconductor supply chain is the most globalized industry in the world. The design might happen in the United States. The manufacturing equipment comes from the Netherlands and Japan. The chemicals come from Germany. The actual fabrication happens in Taiwan or South Korea. The assembly and testing happen in China, Malaysia, and Vietnam. This interdependence is what made the industry so efficient, but it's also what makes it vulnerable to political weaponization. Because if you control enough choke points in the supply chain, you can shut down entire sectors of the industry in rival countries. The United States controls 3 critical choke points. First, the semiconductor design software. Companies like Cadence and Synopsys make the programs that engineers use to design chips. Without this software, you cannot create modern semiconductors. And these companies are American, which means they must comply with US export controls. Second, certain specialized manufacturing equipment. While the most advanced lithography machines come from the Netherlands, many critical tools come from American companies. Applied Materials, Lam Research, and KLA Corporation dominate their respective niches. Chinese chip makers cannot function without access to these tools. Third, the intellectual property and technical know-how. Semiconductor manufacturing is not something you can reverse engineer from a textbook. It requires years of experience, trade secrets, and tacit knowledge that exists only in the heads of engineers. The United States has been pressuring American engineers to quit their jobs with Chinese companies and threatening them with prosecution if they continue to provide technical assistance. The new regulations exploit all 3 of these choke points simultaneously. They cut off the software, they cut off the equipment, and they cut off the people. It is a comprehensive strategy designed to freeze Chinese semiconductor development at its current level while the United States and its allies pull further ahead. The extraterritorial overreach. But the most audacious part of the US strategy is how it forces other countries to comply. The regulations don't just apply to American companies. They apply to any company anywhere in the world that uses American technology in its products. This is called extraterritorial jurisdiction, and it is one of the most powerful and controversial tools in the American economic arsenal. Here's how it works. ASML, the Dutch company that makes the most advanced lithography machines, uses some American components and software in its products. That means the US government claims the authority to control who ASML can sell to, even though ASML is not an American company. The Dutch government initially resisted this pressure. ASML wanted to sell to China. China is a massive market, and ASML stood to make billions of dollars in sales. But the United States made it clear that if the Netherlands didn't comply, there would be consequences. American companies might stop supplying ASML with the components it needs. Dutch companies might find it harder to do business in the United States. The pressure was immense. In the end, the Dutch government caved. They instituted their own export controls that mirror the American restrictions. ASML is now banned from selling its most advanced machines to China. The company's executives have publicly complained about the loss of revenue, but they have no choice. The United States has effectively conscripted them into its economic war against China. The same pattern played out with Japan and South Korea. Tokyo Electron and other Japanese equipment makers were pressured to stop selling to China. Samsung and SK Hynix, the Korean chip makers, were told they could not expand their operations in China. Every country with a significant semiconductor industry has been forced to choose between access to the American market and access to the Chinese market. Most have chosen America, not because they want to, but because the US market and the US-dominated global financial system leave them no alternative. This is economic coercion on a scale rarely seen outside of wartime. China's technological dependence. The reason this ban is so devastating is that China's semiconductor industry is still heavily dependent on foreign technology. Despite decades of investment and despite being the world's largest consumer of semiconductors, China still cannot make the most advanced chips domestically. The numbers tell the story. China imports over $400 billion worth of semiconductors every year. That is more than they spend on oil. Chips are China's single largest import by value. And the majority of those chips, especially the advanced ones, come from Taiwan, South Korea, and the United States. Chinese companies have tried to close this gap. The government has poured hundreds of billions of dollars into the semiconductor industry through programs like Made in China 2025. They've built new fabrication plants. They've subsidized chip makers. They've recruited engineers from around the world with massive salary offers. But they're still years behind. SMEC, China's most advanced chip maker, can produce chips at the 14 nanometer node. That sounds impressive until you realize that TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea are already producing chips at the 3 nanometer node. The gap is enormous, and it's not just about size. The smaller the node, the more transistors you can fit on a chip, the more powerful and energy efficient the chip becomes. This gap matters for everything. Artificial intelligence requires advanced chips to process the massive amounts of data needed for machine learning. China's AI companies, like Alibaba and Baidu, have been buying chips from NVIDIA, an American company. The new U.S. restrictions ban NVIDIA from selling its most advanced AI chips to China. Chinese AI development is now constrained by access to computing power. Military applications are even more sensitive. Modern weapon systems, drones, missiles, fighter jets, all depend on advanced semiconductors. The Chinese military has been trying to indigenize its chip supply to avoid dependence on foreign technology. But they're not there yet. The U.S. restrictions will slow the modernization of the Chinese military by years, possibly decades. The attempted workarounds China is not accepting the situation passively. They are attempting to work around the restrictions in multiple ways. Some of these workarounds are legal, some are in gray areas, and some are outright smuggling operations. The first workaround is stockpiling. When the U.S. restrictions were announced, Chinese companies rushed to buy as much equipment and as many chips as they could before the ban took full effect. They placed massive orders with ASML, Applied Materials, and other suppliers. They build up inventories that they hope will last for years, but stockpiling is a temporary solution. The equipment will eventually break down or become obsolete. The chips will be consumed by production. Without a long-term supply of new equipment and technology, Chinese chip makers will fall further behind. The second workaround is reverse engineering. Chinese companies are buying advanced chips from foreign suppliers and taking them apart to understand how they're made. They're trying to replicate the manufacturing processes and the designs. This is slow, expensive, and often illegal under intellectual property laws. But China is doing it anyway. The third workaround is building relationships with non-aligned countries. China is trying to source equipment and components from countries that are not under U.S. pressure. Russia, for example, has some semiconductor manufacturing capability. But Russian technology is years behind the cutting edge, and Russia itself is under U.S. sanctions. It's not a viable alternative. The fourth workaround is the most ambitious. China is trying to build an entirely indigenous semiconductor supply chain. They're investing in domestic equipment makers. They're trying to develop their own lithography machines, their own deposition tools, their own design software. If they succeed, they will break free from U.S. control entirely. But this is a generational project. Building a competitive semiconductor industry from scratch takes decades. It requires not just money, but also accumulated knowledge, skilled workers, and a dense ecosystem of suppliers and customers. China is trying to compress this timeline, but physics and chemistry don't care about political will. Some processes just take time. In the meantime, Chinese chip makers are stuck. They cannot access the most advanced technology. They cannot compete with their foreign rivals. And their customers, both domestic and international, are starting to look elsewhere. The real target? Artificial intelligence. The semiconductor ban is not really about chips in general. It's about one technology in particular, artificial intelligence. Because the United States has concluded that whoever dominates AI will dominate the future of warfare, the economy, and global power. And they are determined that China will not win that race. AI requires massive amounts of computing power. Training a large language model or image recognition system requires thousands of advanced GPUs, graphics processing units, running for weeks or months. These GPUs are made by companies like NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel, and they require the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing processes to produce. The new U.S. restrictions specifically target AI chips. They ban the export of GPUs that exceed certain performance thresholds. They ban the export of chips designed for data center use. They ban the export of networking equipment that connects AI systems together. The regulations are written to ensure that China cannot build the computing infrastructure needed for cutting-edge AI development. This is a direct attack on China's AI ambitions. Chinese tech companies have been investing heavily in AI. They've been developing facial recognition systems, autonomous vehicles, natural language processing, and military applications. Some of their systems are competitive with or better than American equivalents, but all of that progress depends on access to advanced chips. Without them, Chinese AI development will stagnate. The models will be smaller and less capable, The training times will be longer. The applications will be less sophisticated. China will fall behind in the most important technological race of the 21st century. The United States is making a bet that controlling the semiconductor supply chain gives it control over the future of AI. And they're probably right. AI is not like other technologies, where you can make incremental progress with inferior tools. AI is a field where small advantages in computing power compound rapidly. A model trained with twice as much compute can do things that a smaller model simply cannot. The gap between those with access to advanced chips and those without will only grow. The Chinese response: economic retaliation. China has watched this technological strangulation with growing rage. The Chinese government sees the U.S. restrictions as an existential threat, and they are preparing to fight back with every tool at their disposal. The first tool is rare earth elements. China produces over 70% of the world's rare earths and processes over 90%. These materials are critical for manufacturing semiconductors, batteries, electric vehicles, and advanced weapons. In 2010, China briefly restricted rare earth exports to Japan during a territorial dispute. The impact was immediate and severe. Prices spiked, supply chains were disrupted, Japan capitulated. China could do the same thing to the United States. They could announce that rare earth exports will be restricted or require special licenses. They could prioritize domestic use over foreign exports. They could simply slow down processing and create artificial shortages. Any of these actions would cause chaos in the global technology sector. The United States has been trying to reduce its dependence on Chinese rare earths. They've invested in new mines in the United States and Australia. They've tried to develop recycling technologies. But building a rare earth supply chain takes years. In the short term, the United States is vulnerable. The second tool is the Chinese market. American semiconductor companies make billions of dollars in sales to China. Qualcomm, Intel, Nvidia, Micron, all of them depend on the Chinese market for a significant portion of their revenue. China could retaliate by banning or restricting purchases of American chips. They could pressure Chinese companies to buy from non-American suppliers. They could launch anti-monopoly investigations or intellectual property audits that tie American companies up in legal proceedings for years. This would hurt American companies badly. Their stock prices would collapse. They would have to lay off workers. And they would lobby the U.S. government to reverse the restrictions. China is betting that the pain inflicted on American companies will force a policy change in Washington. The third tool is technology theft. If China cannot buy advanced technology legally, they will steal it. Chinese intelligence services have been accused for years of cyber espionage targeting American tech companies. The indictments and the accusations are endless. Hackers linked to the Chinese government have stolen terabytes of data from semiconductor companies, defense contractors, and research institutions. The U.S. restrictions will only intensify this activity. Chinese intelligence agencies are under immense pressure to close the technology gap. If they cannot do it through legal means, they will do it through illegal ones. And the U.S. semiconductor industry, which depends on secrecy and intellectual property, is a ripe target. The Taiwan factor. But the real nightmare scenario, the one that keeps policymakers in Washington awake at night, is Taiwan. Because Taiwan is not just geographically at the center of the U.S.-China conflict, it is technologically at the center. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, is the most important company in the world that you've never heard of. It produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. Every iPhone contains TSMC chips. Every NVIDIA GPU is made by TSMC. Every advanced AI system runs on TSMC chips. If TSMC stopped producing tomorrow, the global technology industry would collapse within weeks. And TSMC is in Taiwan, an island that China claims as its territory and has vowed to reunify with the mainland by force if necessary. The United States has committed, somewhat ambiguously, to defend Taiwan if China invades. This means that the future of the global semiconductor industry depends on a geopolitical flashpoint that could explode into war at any moment. The semiconductor ban makes this situation even more dangerous. By cutting off China's access to advanced chips, the United States has increased the strategic value of Taiwan. If China cannot buy or make advanced semiconductors, the only way to get them is to take Taiwan by force and seize control of TSMC. Chinese military planners understand this. They are watching American efforts to build semiconductor manufacturing capacity outside of Taiwan. Intel is building new fabs in Arizona and Ohio. TSMC is building a fab in Arizona under immense pressure from the U.S. government. Samsung is expanding in Texas. The United States is trying to reduce its dependence on Taiwan. But these efforts will take years to bear fruit. And even when they're complete, they will not fully replace TSMC's capacity. Taiwan will remain the center of advanced semiconductor manufacturing for the foreseeable future, which means the control of Taiwan will remain the ultimate prize in the U.S.-China technology war. The nightmare scenario is this. China concludes that it cannot close the semiconductor gap through indigenous development. The U.S. restrictions are too effective. The technology is too complex, so China decides to take Taiwan by force. The US military intervenes to defend Taiwan, and the result is a war between two nuclear-armed superpowers, fought over control of the factories that make the chips that run the modern world. This is not a distant hypothetical. Chinese military exercises around Taiwan have intensified. Chinese fighter jets and warships regularly probe Taiwan's defenses. Chinese state media openly discusses the timeline for reunification. And the US military is planning for a potential conflict that would make the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan look like minor skirmishes. The global fracture. The semiconductor ban is not just destroying $300 billion of Chinese industry. It is fracturing the global economy into two competing blocks. One centered on the United States and its allies. One centered on China and its partners. And every country in the world is being forced to choose a side. For countries like South Korea and Taiwan, this is an impossible choice. They are culturally and geographically close to China. China is their largest trading partner, but they are also dependent on American military protection and access to American markets. They cannot afford to alienate either side. The result is a kind of economic schizophrenia. These countries publicly support the US restrictions and implement their own export controls, but privately, they are trying to maintain as much access to the Chinese market as possible. They are playing both sides, and it's a strategy that will eventually fail when the conflict escalates. For Europe, the choice is slightly easier, but still painful. The European Union is closely aligned with the United States on security issues, but European companies have massive investments in China and depend on Chinese consumers. The semiconductor ban is forcing Europe to sacrifice economic interests for geopolitical alignment. For the developing world, the situation is even more stark. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia are watching two superpowers fight over technology dominance. They have no stake in this conflict. They just want access to affordable technology. But they are being told they have to choose. Buy from the American bloc or buy from the Chinese bloc. There is no neutral option. This fracturing will have consequences that extend far beyond semiconductors. The global trading system that has existed since the end of World War II was built on the assumption that economic integration would prevent conflict. The idea was that if countries depend on each other for trade, they won't go to war because the costs would be too high. But the semiconductor ban proves that this assumption is dead. The United States is deliberately decoupling from China, even though it will be economically painful, because it believes the strategic benefits outweigh the costs, and China is preparing for a world where it cannot rely on access to foreign technology. We are witnessing the end of globalization and the beginning of a new era of economic blocs and technological Cold War. The long-term consequences for America. The United States believes it is winning this conflict. American policymakers look at the semiconductor ban and see a successful strategy to contain Chinese technological advancement. They see Chinese companies struggling. They see Chinese AI development constrained. They see the US maintaining its lead in critical technologies. But this confidence may be misplaced because the semiconductor ban has costs for the United States that are only beginning to become apparent. The first cost is the loss of the Chinese market. American semiconductor companies have been making tens of billions of dollars in annual sales to China. That revenue funds research and development. It pays for the next generation of technology. When you cut off access to the Chinese market, you cut off a major source of funding for American innovation. Intel, Qualcomm, and NVIDIA have all warned that the restrictions will hurt their businesses. Their stock prices have been volatile. They are laying off workers and cutting R&D budgets. The American semiconductor industry is being asked to sacrifice its own growth to serve a geopolitical strategy. And it's not clear that this sacrifice will be worth it. The second cost is the acceleration of Chinese self-sufficiency. The semiconductor ban is forcing China to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in building an indigenous semiconductor industry. Yes, this will take years. Yes, they will make mistakes and waste money. But eventually, they will succeed. And when they do, they will no longer need American technology at all. In other words, the United States is using its current technological advantage to create a future competitor. By cutting off China now, America is guaranteeing that China will develop the capability to compete independently in the future. The ban might buy the United States a few years of advantage, but the long-term result will be a world with two competing semiconductor industries, and the American industry will have lost access to the largest market in the world. The third cost is the weaponization of economic interdependence. For decades, the United States has benefited from the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency and that American companies dominate critical technologies. Countries around the world had no choice but to work with American companies and play by American rules. But the semiconductor ban has shown the world that the United States is willing to weaponize this dominance. It will cut off access to technology for political reasons. It will use export controls as a tool of geopolitical competition. And every country that depends on American technology is now asking itself, are we next? This is driving a massive effort to reduce dependence on American technology. The European Union is investing in its own semiconductor industry. India is trying to build fabs. Even American allies are hedging against the possibility that they might be cut off in a future dispute. The long-term result will be a less dominant position for American technology companies and a less powerful dollar. The innovation slowdown. But perhaps the most damaging long-term consequence is the impact on innovation itself. The semiconductor industry has thrived on global collaboration. Engineers from different countries work together. Companies specialize in different parts of the supply chain. Ideas flow freely across borders. This openness has driven rapid technological progress for decades. The semiconductor ban ends that era. It replaces collaboration with competition. It replaces open sharing of ideas with paranoid secrecy. It forces every bloc to duplicate the efforts of every other bloc. This is massively inefficient. It slows down innovation. It wastes resources. Think about it this way. Right now, there are brilliant semiconductor engineers in China who cannot access American technology. There are brilliant engineers in America who cannot collaborate with their Chinese counterparts. The problems they could solve together, the innovations they could create, are being sacrificed for geopolitical competition. The result will be a slower pace of technological advancement. The breakthroughs will take longer. The next generation of chips will be delayed, and ultimately this will hurt everyone. The American consumer will pay higher prices for technology. The Chinese consumer will have access to inferior products. And the developing world will be caught in the middle, unable to access the best technology from either bloc. The precedent for future wars. The semiconductor ban is not just about chips. It is a blueprint for how economic conflicts will be fought in the 21st century. And the lessons from this conflict will shape how nations compete for decades to come. The first lesson is that control of critical technologies is more important than military superiority. The United States is not defeating China with aircraft carriers or missiles. It is defeating China by controlling access to the machines that make semiconductors. This is power exercised through supply chains, not through firepower. Other countries are taking note. Every nation is now asking, what are our critical dependencies? What technologies do we rely on that could be cut off in a conflict? And how do we reduce those dependencies? This is leading to a massive push for technological sovereignty. Countries want to control their own supply chains for critical goods. They want to reduce dependence on potential adversaries. This will lead to enormous investments in redundant capacity, in duplicated research, in protected markets. It will make the global economy less efficient and more fragmented. The second lesson is that alliances matter more than ever. The United States was able to implement the semiconductor ban because it convinced its allies to go along. Japan, South Korea, and the Netherlands all agreed to restrict their companies from selling to China. Without this alliance, the ban would have failed. Chinese companies would have simply bought from non-American suppliers. This means that future economic conflicts will be fought through coalition building. Nations will compete to assemble blocs of allied countries that control critical supply chains. We are entering an era of economic alliance systems that looks disturbingly similar to the military alliance systems that preceded World War I. The third lesson is that economic warfare can be just as devastating as military warfare, but with fewer immediate consequences. The semiconductor ban will destroy hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese wealth and slow Chinese development for years. But it won't kill anyone directly. There will be no dramatic footage of explosions or casualties. The suffering will be slower and less visible: economic stagnation, lost opportunities, diminished futures. This makes economic warfare more attractive to policymakers. It allows them to inflict pain on adversaries without the domestic political costs of military action. And it makes it more likely that these conflicts will escalate, because each side can always justify the next round of restrictions as a proportional response. There is a historical parallel that should terrify anyone paying attention. In the 1930s, the United States imposed an oil embargo on Japan. The embargo was intended to punish Japan for its aggression in China and to prevent Japan from building a stronger military. But the embargo had an unintended consequence. It convinced Japanese leaders that they were being strangled, that they had no choice but to break out of American encirclement through military action. The result was Pearl Harbor and the Pacific War. The semiconductor ban is a similar form of economic encirclement. The United States is trying to prevent China from accessing the technology it needs to grow and to compete. And Chinese leaders are interpreting this as an existential threat that must be answered. The question is how China will respond. Will they accept technological inferiority and focus on other sectors of the economy? Will they double down on indigenous development and wait patiently for decades to close the gap? Or will they conclude that the only way to break the American stranglehold is through military action, seizing Taiwan and its semiconductor industry by force? No one knows the answer. But the historical precedent suggests that economic encirclement often leads to military conflict. Nations that feel they are being strangled economically will eventually lash out militarily. And in the case of China, a country with the world's largest military and nuclear weapons, the consequences of that lashing out would be catastrophic. The United States is gambling that China will accept its diminished technological position peacefully. But that is a very dangerous bet, and if history is any guide, it is a bet that often fails. What happens next? The semiconductor ban is not the end of the economic war between the United States and China. It is the beginning. Both sides are now locked in a competition that will define the rest of the 21st century. And the outcome is far from certain. The United States has the advantage right now. It controls critical choke points in the semiconductor supply chain. Its companies make the most advanced chips. Its allies, for now, are willing to follow American leadership. But this advantage is temporary. China is investing massively to close the gap, and over time, that investment will pay off. The question is whether the United States can maintain its lead long enough to make it permanent. Can American companies innovate fast enough to stay ahead? Can the U.S. government convince its allies to stay aligned as the costs of confrontation become clear? Can America build enough domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity to reduce dependence on Taiwan before China decides to take Taiwan by force? These are the questions that will determine the future of global power, and the answers are not obvious. For China, the path forward is brutally difficult. They have to build an entire semiconductor industry from scratch, while being cut off from the most advanced foreign technology. They have to train hundreds of thousands of engineers. They have to develop manufacturing processes that took other countries decades to perfect. And they have to do all of this while their economy is slowing and their population is aging. But China has advantages too. They have a massive domestic market. They have a government willing to spend unlimited amounts of money on strategic priorities. They have a long-term planning horizon that democracies struggle to match. And they have a deep well of national resentment against Western dominance that motivates their efforts. The collision between American technological superiority and Chinese determination will shape the world for generations. And the semiconductor industry is ground zero for that collision. The world that's coming. What is clear is that the world that emerges from this conflict will look very different from the world we have now. The era of globalization, of free trade, of technology companies operating across borders without political interference, that era is over. We are entering a new age of economic blocks, technological sovereignty, and great power competition. For ordinary people, this means higher prices, fewer choices, and slower technological progress. It means your electronics will be more expensive because supply chains are less efficient. It means the next generation of technology will take longer to arrive because innovation is being duplicated rather than shared. It means the benefits of global cooperation are being sacrificed for geopolitical rivalry. For nations, it means a constant struggle to secure access to critical resources and technologies. It means choosing sides in a conflict between superpowers. It means investing in redundant capabilities to reduce dependence on potential adversaries. It means living with the constant threat that economic cooperation could be weaponized in a future dispute. And for the superpowers themselves, it means an arms race. Not an arms race for nuclear weapons or fighter jets, but an arms race for semiconductors, for artificial intelligence, for quantum computing, for the technologies that will determine who dominates the future. It is a race with no finish line, because the technology keeps advancing and the competition never ends. The bet that can't be taken back. The semiconductor ban is a bet. The United States is betting that it can cripple Chinese technological development without triggering a military response. It is betting that its allies will stay aligned even as the economic costs mount. It is betting that American companies can maintain their technological lead even as they lose access to the largest market in the world. These are enormous bets, and they cannot be taken back. Once you weaponize economic interdependence, you destroy the trust that made that interdependence possible. Chinese leaders will never again believe that they can rely on foreign technology for critical applications. They will spend whatever it takes to achieve self-sufficiency. And when they succeed, the American leverage will be gone forever. The semiconductor ban destroyed $300 billion of Chinese industry with a stroke of a pen. But it also destroyed something more fundamental, the belief that economic cooperation between great powers is possible. It replaced that belief with the certainty that economic power will be weaponized in service of geopolitical goals. And once that certainty takes hold, once nations start planning for economic conflict rather than economic cooperation, the drift toward actual war becomes almost inevitable. Because nations that see each other as economic enemies will eventually see each other as military enemies too. The line between the two kinds of conflict is thinner than most people realize. The semiconductor ban was signed on October 17, 2023, but its consequences will echo for decades. It is the opening shot in a technological Cold War that will reshape the global economy. And just like the first Cold War, this one could turn hot if the wrong decisions are made by the wrong people at the wrong time. The $300 billion question is whether anyone will have the wisdom to step back from the brink before it's too late.